Everyday Hate with Dave Hirsh. The Hamas terror attack on Israel on October the 7th last year sparked a wave of anti-Jewish hatred across the world. Synagogues were burned, Jews attacked, and protests raged, with calls for Israel to be erased from the map. It is as if this most ancient of prejudices continues to seduce even the most educated, empathetic, and well-meaning members of society. Dr. Dave Hirsh is one of this country's leading experts on anti-Semitism, and his latest book, Everyday Hate: How Anti-Semitism is Built into Our World and How You Can Change It, is a tour de force of the history and present reality of anti-Semitism, fully updated to address the events of the 7th of October and all that followed. Dr. Dave Hirsh is one of the UK's leading experts on anti-Semitism. He has worked for almost 30 years for the Community Security Trust, a Jewish charity that protects the UK Jewish community, and has advised the police, the CPS, football clubs, political parties, and many other organisations on how to tackle anti-Semitism. This is his second book, following The Left's Jewish Problem, Jeremy Corbyn, Israel and Anti-Semitism. Dave is a research fellow at the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and is on the editorial board of the Journal of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. His academic work includes chapters and articles about hate crime, conspiracy theories, the abuse of Holocaust memory, anti-Israel boycotts, campus anti-Semitism, and the campaign for Soviet Jewry. He has written for all the main news outlets and blogs regularly about anti-Semitism and related topics at his personal Substack, Everyday Hate.
Very welcome, everybody. This is a seminar around Dave Hirsh's book, Everyday Hate. The book was published, I think, a year ago or so, and Dave has updated the book with 2 new chapters since October the 7th. Dave, I think the same thing happened to your first book, did it not? That you published the book and then you had to update it in the light of new events, which I think at the time was the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. And your excellent Everyday Hate similarly has had to be updated after the 7th of October. Let me start by asking you about 7th of October. I think many people, especially the Jewish community, had a feeling that 7th of October changed everything, or changed a lot. And I remember puzzling over this quite a lot and thinking, well, look, there have been previous attacks on Israel, for example, in 48, in 67, in 73, that have been led by, the whole Arab League and tanks and air cover. And we always said that those, if successful, may well lead to a disaster for Jews in Israel. There have been other events like the attack on the Olympic Games, like hijackings and the attack on the community center in Argentina, for example. Many very serious events. So can you help us make sense of the feeling that 7th of October was something completely new and different?
Thanks, and good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining this. I think there are 3 things that made what happened on 7th of October different. And you're right, David, that look, Israel has been through wars before. It's been through endless terrorism. There have been terrorist attacks on Jewish communities around the world. So in that respect, and of course, Israel, whenever Israel has a war, we see these big spikes in anti-Semitism. That's not new either. So in those respects, there was a lot happened after 7th of October that wasn't new and shouldn't, in theory, have had such a profound impact on on the feelings and the sensibilities of Jewish people all around the world, but October 7th did. It was clearly something different. It was a watershed. I think I write in the updated edition of Everyday Hate that anti-Semitism in 2024 is different from from anti-Semitism in 2022, and October 7th is the reason why. And I think there are three things about it. The first thing is that for a brief period, for a few hours on October 7th, we caught a glimpse of what a world without Israel would be like, what it would feel like if Israel was weak and indefensible, and if its enemies were able to destroy it. And I think for Jewish people around the world, that is something that we have never really had to confront previously, certainly for my generation that don't remember the wars of 1973 and 1967. And frankly, I think a lot of us found it terrifying. And I think this affected Jewish people who are not especially connected to Israel or involved in the Jewish community, just as much, if not more so, than those who are. I think there was something of a revelation for many of us that actually, in a subliminal way, in a way that we really did not recognize even within ourselves, never mind discuss within the community, we relied on Israel in an emotional and psychological way, just on it being there in the background, for good or ill, for all the things you love about it, or that it drives you nuts or whatever, and all the politics. The fact that it's there, I write in the book, the whole Jewish experience since the Shoah has been one huge project in hope over experience. Can we rebuild a coherent, positive, flourishing Jewish life in the world after the Shoah? And the platform on which that was built was Israel, even for those of us who don't live there. But I don't think we recognize that until on that day we got a glimpse of what happens if that platform is shaken so much that we feel like we're going to fall off. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is the manner of what happened on October 7th. Like I say, we've seen terrorism, Israel's fought wars. We're kind of used to that. What we're not used to seeing in this century is a pogrom. And that was a pogrom. And it very quickly was identified and recognized by Jews around the world as the kind of things that our great-grandparents fled from, whichever countries they fled. And this was not supposed to happen in a world in which Israel exists. This was the great promise of Zionism, was that the days of defenseless Jews being massacred in such large numbers were gone. And then all of a sudden it happened again. And it was almost like we were plunged back into like we've been back in a time machine and plunged back into the world of our forebears, whether that's in the Russia of, Ukraine of 1919, or Russia of 1905, or the Rhineland in 1096, or, you can go way back. And the third thing that I think was different about October 7th was that the anti-Semitism around the world began immediately. Now, again, we're used to Israel. When Israel fights wars, we get big spikes in anti-Jewish hate crime around the world. We get the big protests, everything. But normally, that is, or we have always interpreted that as an expression of anger about what people see or believe Israel to be doing in Gaza. They see pictures of terrible Palestinian suffering. It makes them really angry. And in a misguided, you can sort of understand the thought process, even though it's obviously wrong kind of way, they take it out on local Jews. But this was different. What people were seeing on October 7th was images of dead Jews, murdered Jews, stories of kidnapped Jews, of raped Jews, and people went out to celebrate. People actually went out to celebrate. They organized their protests where they welcomed it as a great triumph. And they started going around shouting abuse at Jewish people in the street. The anti-Semitism began straight away. And it was almost as if there are some people in our own societies who wanted to join in, who saw the what happened on October 7th, and they were in their own way, mostly not in a violent way, but in a political, in a rhetorical way, wanted to join in. there was one incident that was reported to CST a day or two after 7th of October that really stuck in my mind because the language used, and so much so that I used it as the title for one of the new chapters in the book. Regular Jewish guy walking down the street in London, and some stranger who's driving past shouts at him, "The war is starting, free Palestine," like in a celebratory, come on kind of way. And it was exactly that. People saw it's happening and we want to join in with it. And we're going to join in with it by abusing, harassing, attacking Jewish people. And I think, again, the fact that that happened and it landed on Jewish communities that were in utter shock and grief, it meant that everything that followed would just took a different path and had a different impact from what we'd seen, you know, in the last war in Gaza 3 years ago, or the one before that 10 years ago, and so on and so on, because that was the starting point.
So I ought to have mentioned in Dave's introduction, but in my head, like everybody knows, Dave is the head of policy at the CST, at the Community Security Trust, which is the Jewish communal organization that is concerned with keeping the Jewish community in Britain safe and with dealing with and thinking about anti-Semitism. So a couple of things already from what you've said. I mean, many things actually. One of them was you talked about Zionism, and you talked about the way that the 7th of October made people in the diaspora outside of Israel feel. And of course, people also felt hugely different inside Israel. I mean, immediately, you know, in the area that was attacked, as Danny Trom said, there was this experience of calling for help and no help being there. And I think that feeling resonated across Israel. But in terms of the post-war sort of settlement of Jewish life, it was a kind of interplay between Israel and the diaspora. Like when the big Jewish communities in America and Europe embraced Zionism as an idea, it didn't mean that they went to Israel, right? They didn't go to Israel, but there's some sense, I think, in which Zionism enabled them to stay where they were, and that there was a sort of equilibrium between the two. And then lots of talk about the two worlds kind of moving apart, but October the 7th has kind of reworked that, but has given feelings of insecurity to both. And I'm sure you're right. So many people felt that Israel was invulnerable, that it was so strong. There was that all of the talk about Israel's precariousness was sort of Zionist hype invented in order to frighten everybody. And then suddenly people both in Israel and outside Israel, but in slightly different ways, felt that precariousness.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, it was at a quite a profound level. I mean, David Cesarani, one of his many great insights in his work was that Zionism came to provide a secular diaspora Jewish identity from kind of the 1960s and 1970s onwards, that it wasn't so much about the concrete reality of supporting Israel in a political sense. It became this sort of cohesive Jewish identity that replaced religion and so on for a lot of people. And so when Israel is attacked anyway, we know this, a lot of Jewish people feel it as an attack on them, even though it's not necessarily. So when there is an attack as devastating, as catastrophic, as strategic as what happened on October 7th, a lot of Jewish people felt it in their own sense of themselves being under attack. It felt like an attack on the entire Jewish world, on the very concept of Jewishness in a way, in that way. And I think in some ways it did then bring the diaspora and Israel together. You know, we've always talked about how you have anti-Semitism and you have criticism of Israel and you have hatred of Israel, and there's an interplay, but they're not the same thing. And, you know, at CST, we don't do Israel advocacy. We only deal with anti-Semitism in Britain. And we try and observe that separation, right? Because they're different things. And then October 7th came along and Hamas just sort of smashed that separation to pieces in terms of how we felt. But I think also what it revealed is a political reality that I think we knew and we use, and it's part of kind of Israel's talking points, but I think this really brought it home, is that Hamas, really is an enemy of the Jewish people, not just an opponent of Israel in a conflict. That this is an organization that is deeply, deeply anti-Semitic in its ideology and in its propaganda. And the fact that it only tries to kill Jews in one particular country doesn't transform the nature of what they are and what they do. And so when you then have people on British streets supporting Hamas, on whether it's on protests, whether it's on social media, whether it's in campuses and so on, either explicitly saying they support Hamas or repeating the slogans, the core slogans, and endorsing the core goals of Hamas, it's impossible, I think, to just treat that as a political position in a, overseas conflict. It has meaning for us here or in the States or in any diaspora community as Jews to be sharing our public spaces, sharing our universities, sharing our streets with people who are willing to march behind the ideas and the slogans and the discourse of that organization.
And things are still coded in a way. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, for example, from the river to the sea, and talk about, I know that one of the things that I had to do some thinking about was the slogan going around my campus, probably many, demanding that the Palestinian right to self-defense be recognized, which, that needs a context, right? Famously, the word context has become important in this discussion. But in the immediate aftermath of the 7th of October, it felt to me as though what people meant when they said self-defense is no offense was that what they meant was that the murder and kidnap and sexual violence against 1,000 Jews was no offense.
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on here. One of them is there is this kind of completely baseless idea, but very widespread idea, and it comes from Frantz Fanon, and it comes from a lot of that sort of very radical, violent, anti-colonial thinking, that any kind of violence by the colonized against colonizers, by oppressed against oppressors, any kind of violence is legitimate. And it's not the case that, slaughtering entire families in their homes is legitimate. But it's politically legitimized in this discourse. And it comes down to this idea that Israel is, in its entirety, a settler colonial entity. After 7th of October, you had a lot of people, including a lot of academics of British and American universities, saying this is decolonization in action. This is what you get if you're settler colonizer. And we need to remember the entirety of the October 7th attack by Hamas took place on territory that is universally recognized throughout the world as sovereign Israeli territory, that is not contested in international law at all. This is not something that happened within Gaza or within the West Bank or even in East Jerusalem. This is as Israel as it gets. And if that territory, if those kibbutzim are as illegitimate as the most illegal hilltop settlement in the West Bank, then the whole of Israel is illegitimate. And that's exactly the point. That's the whole point. And if the whole of Israel is a settler colony and it's all illegitimate, then Israelis have no rights, no matter who they are, no matter how many generations their family have been there, even if they are a newborn baby and their family's been there for 200 years, they do not even have the right to live on that land. That's the thinking, that's the meaning. And that's where you get this blanket justification of everything that Hamas did, or denial of the most inconvenient bits, such as the sexual violence. And, you know, this phrase from the river to the sea, you know, you're right. Some of this is coded and some of it is ambiguous, and some of the slogans are deliberately ambiguous. But Hamas uses the phrase from the river to the sea all the time. It's written into their 2017 Declaration of Principles that the entire, the whole of Palestine, from the river to the sea, from the north to south, is Palestine. Not an inch of it is Israel. And I actually had an argument about this with Ben Jamal, who's the director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We were both giving evidence in Parliament, the Home Affairs Select Committee, back in December. He was doing first, then me. And when I finished my session, I came out of the room. He was waiting in the corridor and started shouting at me in quite an angry way that I was promulgating anti-Palestinian racism. And I asked him what he meant, because I was pretty sure I wasn't. And his reason was that I had stayed silent while the other witness in my session had said that the From the River to the Sea chant is genocidal, right? Why he didn't pick on the other guy, I don't know. But anyway, and I had this whole argument with him. And I said to him, as far as I'm concerned, it means there should be no Israel and Israel should be wiped out. And the point is, we've seen how Hamas want to achieve that. You know, I'm a big believer that in the end, it's about practical politics. It's about who is it that's actually on the ground trying to implement these things. And it's Hamas. They are the Islamic Resistance Movement. That's their full name. And we've seen how they intend to cleanse the territory from the river to the sea. And his reply to that was, well, Hamas are irrelevant, which I thought was a, you know, bizarre thing to say. I mean, they're probably the most relevant out of all of us, certainly a lot more relevant than I am or he is. But it is this kind of playing around with language, playing around with words, when it's kind of whatever people marching in London think they mean when they're chanting that slogan. It is the slogan of the organization that murdered, tortured, raped and kidnapped 1,200 people on October 7th and have pledged to do it again and again and again until Israel is annihilated. That's their slogan. So that is who this political movement in Britain is lining up behind in the region. That's the force in the region they are aligning themselves with, whether they like it or not. And the fact is, Hamas know it, and Iran know it. I mean, Ayatollah Khamenei last week published a letter to American students saying, thank you for your support. You are now another front in the resistance movement. So they get it, but the students and the marchers here don't seem to get it.
So, Dave, just walk me through something you said a little bit earlier on, which was that the upsurge of anti-Semitism on the 7th of October began immediately. So there was the most serious day of anti-Semitic violence since the Shoah. And on that very day, the world, or many people across the world, were inspired to become more anti-Semitic. And it wasn't the case that there was a moment of great sympathy for Jews and for Israel and for the victims of anti-Semitism. But then 2 or 3 days later, when it was seen that, you know, the terrible, ferocious response of the Israelis, that then people got angry with Israel, that wasn't what happened. What happened was that the immediate response to a day of anti-Semitic violence was anti-Semitism. Walk me through that slower, because it's kind of astonishing.
Well, look, let's be clear what we're talking about. Most people who were paying attention to this were utterly horrified. And there was a wave of sympathy for Israel and for Jewish people in many countries. And national buildings were lit up in support. It may have taken a couple of days and a bit of pressure and a bit of pointing the finger at why haven't you done it? But it did kind of happen. And lots of us did get some messages from friends. One of the first messages of support and sympathy that I received was from Iman Abu Atta, who is the director of Tel Mama, which is the organization that monitors anti-Muslim hatred in Britain. And she's a Palestinian woman. So there was a lot of sympathy out there. But for those people who hate Israel, for that movement, that political movement, October 7th was a moment of celebration. And there's no doubt about that because they went out and celebrated. I mean, there were videos on Twitter of people driving through parts of London, waving Palestinian flags, honking their horns. You know, basically there was a protest at the Israeli embassy 2 days later, and people were partying. They brought drums, they were dancing. There was no anger. There was happiness. So for that section, that segment of society that we're talking about, that movement, that's who I mean. Now, what does that tell us? Now, like I say, in the past, whenever Israel has a war, we get these big spikes in anti-Semitism. It happens every time. But normally, the pictures and the narrative and the story that we're seeing from day one is Israel has gone into Gaza or invaded Lebanon, and all the pictures are of people who are killed or injured or suffering or houses destroyed by the Israeli army. And that fires everyone up. It gets people really angry. And they take out that anger on Jewish people in their local countries. Now, that in itself needs a lot of unpacking because when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was no wave of anti-Russian hate crime in Britain. You didn't see Russian, you didn't need extra security at Russian Orthodox churches. It didn't happen. It only really happens with this conflict, and that is a thing in itself. But at least with that way round, however irrational and unjustified the thought process that leads people to do it, you can sort of follow it. But what happened this time was, in Britain, the first anti-Semitic incident reported to CST on October 7th was lunchtime that day, and it was someone driving past a synagogue as people were leaving Shabbat morning prayers, waving a Palestinian flag and shaking their fist at them. And from that day, the number of incidents reported went up, first threefold, then sixfold, then tenfold. And the week that had the highest weekly total of anti-Semitic incidents reported CST was that first week after 7th of October, not the week after Israeli forces went into Gaza on the ground, or after the explosion at the Al-Ahli hospital, or after Israeli forces went into Al-Shifa hospital, or et cetera, et cetera. There were all these moments in the military campaign in Gaza where lots of people died and there was huge public attention. But that isn't what caused the highest number of incidents. What caused the highest number of incidents was October 7th. And what does that tell us? It tells us that section we're talking about, that movement, is fundamentally an anti-Semitic movement. Right? Now, within a couple of weeks, you've got loads more people coming on. You get the demonstrations go from 10,000 to 100,000. And all those extra people, I think, are coming from a different place, from a more humanitarian place. You may argue they're misguided, whatever, but that's what swells this movement to such dramatic sizes. But at its core, it's an anti-Semitic movement. And we saw that in those early days because the context gave it no other explanation.
So that feels like it leads me on to ask you about genocide, about this charge of genocide. Now, imagine if the Israeli attack against Hamas had been met with a kind of explicit peace movement, which said, we perfectly understand why Israel is angry with Hamas, but this is not the way to defend itself. There's huge numbers of civilian casualties, and it's an unwise thing to do. And Israel, when it attacked Hamas, knew that there would be many, many casualties, and it should stop doing that. If that had been the movement, well, that would have been one thing. But the movement was not that. The movement was a movement which said Israel is committing genocide, like Nazis do. And within that is the claim that Israel is deliberately murdering many thousands of Palestinian children. So can you help us with the specific meaning and force, really, of those two things, of the child murdering charge and the genocide charge?
So, I mean, look, these are things that have been around for a very long time. I mean, people have been accusing Israel of committing genocide since well before October 7th, and it was always a nonsensical claim back then, because Palestinian population had increased so dramatically, and that's not what tends to happen in genocides. I mean, the child murdering charge goes back to the 12th century. This is literally a medieval charge of ritual murder, of blood libel, and it's something that crops up time and time again through history. And you know, in history, I always shy away from describing allegations against Israel as blood libels, and I'll explain why. I know it happens a lot, that allegation. So after the explosion at the Al Ahli hospital, if you remember this one, the news broke that Israel had bombed a hospital in Gaza. This was back in October, November, and 500 people had died. And it turned out that Israel hadn't bombed this hospital at all. It was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket had fallen short, and significantly fewer than 500 people had died, although we still don't know an exact number. But it went around the world. It was reported by every media organization. I mean, the BBC sent it as a push notification to God knows how many millions of mobile phones, but everyone did this. And afterwards, quite a few people called this a blood libel, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. I mean, government ministers here referred to it in that way, because the blood libel was always the false allegation that Jews kill Christian children for ritual purposes, for religious purposes. Now, I don't particularly like applying the blood libel framing to specific allegations like that for one simple reason, which is that in the Middle Ages and all the way through to the modern period, the blood libel allegations were all false. They were all false. It was never the case that Jews kidnapped any children, Christian or otherwise, and drained their blood to make matzah and killed them in a mock reenactment of the crucifixion at Easter time, which was the allegation. And yet, you know, Israel is a real country with a real army, and they fight real wars, and children do die. They do get killed in very tragic circumstances. And I'd like to believe always accidentally, but it happens. And I think that in itself, you know, grappling with the rights and wrongs of how to conduct military operations in Gaza and do it within the law. And does Israel always get it right, or do they sometimes get it wrong? And I'm not a military expert. I'm not an international law expert. I'm not in that theatre. That's a very different thing from the kind of anti-Semitic folk tales that led to massacres of Jews and expulsions in medieval Europe. But there is a connection. They're not the same thing, but there is a connection here. And the connection is something that Anthony Julius wrote about in his book, Trials of the Diaspora, that the blood libel is like the meta-narrative, the meta-framing for all kind of negative storytelling about Jews. The idea that Jews are unusually and inhumanely cruel and bloodthirsty and have a particular taste for killing children, not that it always has to be children, but that kind of idea, that frames so much of negative storytelling about Jews, and it's there in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and it's there in the story of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, and there's echoes of it in Fagin, and so on and so on. In lots of English literature, but also more broadly. So when you get negative stories about Israel, especially ones that are factually unsound, when they key into those key ideas, when they connect with those key ideas about the bloodthirstiness, the cruelty, the fact that the allegation that Jews deliberately enjoy killing children, either for religious purposes or just for fun or whatever, it connects these allegations against Israel to these very old, very deeply held anti-Semitic myths and libels that have been around for many centuries, up to 1,000 years and more, that have been sowed and replicated and disseminated by some of our greatest writers and thinkers. Throughout history, anti-Semitism has not been, or was not, it's not like it's just been a preserve of fringe extremists and cranks that no one pays attention to. It's been reproduced by some of the greatest writers and creators and cultural and artistic and political and philosophical thinkers in all of our history. So no wonder it sticks. No wonder it's so powerful and so deeply embedded. And that's where, you know, a lot of the things that get thrown at Israel, and this is not to in any way deny that I'm sure Israel's done a lot of things wrong in this war. Like I say, I'm not a military expert, but you know, every army gets stuff wrong. But it's the way that there are certain types of language, certain images and motifs that just connect the current sort of just, you know, wave of hostility towards Israel and the discourse that drives it to some of those very old anti-Semitic ideas. And I think that's where it really gets its energy. That's the connection that really drives it on, that makes it kind of resonate. It fits, it goes with the grain of our world. It just sort of makes sense to people because deep down, our world thinks they know that when Jews commit their crimes, this is how they commit them. So it just kind of makes sense.
So every army gets things wrong, and many nations do terrible things, but genocide and child murder is inherent within Israel in its essence. That's presumably the kicker, what comes from the idea that there is no part of Israel that is legitimate. And that is because so long as Israel exists, it will be genocidal and it will be murdering children because it's in its nature.
Yeah, I think it's that. It's the idea that it is in its innate character. And this connects the fact that this is the only conflict on earth where the solution that is offered by a lot of people, including people who think they are progressive, is to just get rid of one of the countries entirely. You know, there's no one looks at Russia and Ukraine and says, well, Russia just shouldn't exist. Or looks at how many, you know, the United Nations estimated, I think 377,000 people died because of the war in Yemen in the space of about 7 years. No one looks at that and says, well, Saudi Arabia just shouldn't exist. And yet Saudi Arabia is, if anything, more artificial and more a creation of colonialism than Israel is. So there's that's another unique aspect to this. But something else that's going on is, and I think this is a really important part of this, it's not just that, you know, genocide and colonialism and murder and all the rest of it is seen to be part of Israel's character. It's seen to be part of the West's character and our history, and you get this massive displacement onto Israel of the crimes and the shameful histories of our countries in the past. And also, and this has always been the case, that you know, Jews have always played this kind of scapegoat role in societies. And I definitely think there's something going on with that. You know, the allegation that Israel is a settler colonial entity, that it's a racist state and so on, has been around for decades. But it really got kind of popular purchase after the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2021. And Western societies started grappling for the first time with, in Britain's case, imperial legacy and its impact here in Britain. You know, with ideas of white supremacy and structures of racism, which had been commonplace in sort of left-wing discourse for a long time, but not really beyond that. And all of a sudden it was. And I don't think it's a coincidence that at that point, this slogan, this idea that Israel-Palestine, it's not a conflict, it's colonialism, became the dominant mode of thinking, the dominant theme of anti-Israel discourse. You know, there was one incident that I picked up on that I mentioned in the books. I think it's very telling. A bunch of protesters went into the British Museum in February and did like an occupation of the main sort of atrium in the British Museum. A couple of hundred of them, they sat on the floor with their banners and their flags and whatever. And they were protesting because the British Museum had done a sponsorship deal with BP, right, an oil company, and BP have some sort of investment in oil and gas fields off the coast of Israel. I mean, I think it's pretty minor, but these protesters joined them all together. And what they were protesting against was colonial genocide and climate change, you know, and climate and fossil fuels. And it's like the perfect encapsulation of our country's kind of greatest, most shameful crimes of the past, you know, colonialism and genocide, and our greatest fears for the future with climate. And they all get wrapped up. And what's the target for them? It's Israel, right? As if Israel is the greatest offender in any of those areas at all, which of course it isn't. So I think there's a lot of displacement going on in this movement.
So that's the way in which anti-Zionism becomes not something about the Israel and Palestine conflict, or not something about Israel at all, but anti-Zionism becomes an ideology that is key to everything in the world, right? To climate change and to colonialism and to the future of world happiness. I don't know if you remember, there was a commentator literally who said, after lost the general election, who said, so long as Zionism exists, we can't have good things, nice things. We can't have nice things because of Zionism in Britain. We can't have a decent health service because of Zionism.
Yeah, I mean, look, in the same way that anti-Semitism is not about Jews, it's about the world, and it's about trying to reshape, explain, and then reshape the world. And, you know, there was a meme that went around on social media last week that was very popular. It was like a Venn diagram of, you know, racism, patriarchy, capitalism, environmental terrorism, settler colonialism, misogyny, etc., etc. And in the middle is Palestine. It says Palestine connects it all. And there is no fathomable, meaningful way in which Palestine connects capitalism with patriarchy, with environmental terrorism. I mean, it's meaningless. And the idea that if Israel was got rid of and Palestine became free, that any of these things would end. I mean, judging by who the likely rulers of a Palestinian state would be, it would just be another patriarchal capitalist state. It wouldn't reduce the amount of any of these things in the world. But that's not the point. It's this idea of having, you know, the Jewish question, the status of the Jews, or now the status of Israel, and the Zionist question is like the locking nut that if you can just undo it, it opens up all these other things, you know. And of course, it has no basis in reality, but this is how these very old ways of anti-Semitic thinking just get replicated in some of this more extreme kind of anti-Zionism. And it's like, you know, David Miller, who I'm sure is familiar to all of us, he tweeted, I think last year, you know, our goal is not to create a Palestinian state, it's to dismantle Zionism. And that's the point. That's what it's about.
Yep. To end every Zionist organization in the world, which of course in his terms means end every Jewish communal organization in the world. I would be very, very happy to talk to you for hours, Dave, conscious of the time. I want one question and maybe another one or two, and then we're going to go and get some questions from people who are here. And the question is this. I remember, I don't know when it was, a couple of months ago, or maybe more, there was a day anti-Semitism was at the top of the news agenda in Britain. And I think it was because of one of the CST surveys had been published. There was a front page in the Daily Express and in the Times, and it was the lead story on the BBC Today programme, which is like the flagship BBC radio programme in the morning. And I remember thinking, well, it can't be that terrible if anti-Semitism is at the top of the news agenda and the country today anyway is taking this seriously. And I thought, why doesn't that feel good? And then I kind of realized that I thought one of the reasons was because every other day on the Today programme, they are at least allowing the idea that Israel commits genocide and murders children to be a respectable side of a respectable debate. So on this day, they were saying, oh my gosh, it's terrible. There's all this anti-Semitism. Where does it come from? Who is responsible? And every other day, they are allowing people on their program and treating it as serious that Israelis are murdering children and that Jews around the world mostly are supporting it and excusing it.
Yeah, I think this speaks to another reason why the last 8 months now have been so difficult for Jewish people, certainly in Britain, and I expect in other countries as well, is that it has just felt like we are under a relentless spotlight every single day. The news is leading with stories, either stories from Gaza or stories about anti-Semitism or arguments about the protests, arguments about campus, and it's like we don't get a break. And, you know, day after day, you know, it will be the top 5 or 6 stories on the BBC News app or whatever. I think a lot of Jewish people have just switched off and stopped following the news as a result of this. And it's a very uncomfortable feeling and a very unusual feeling because as a community, we're traditionally a community that sort of keeps their head down and stays out of the limelight and gets on with things. And that's, everyone's happy with that. So then when you get a day like you say, where there's lots of coverage of anti-Semitism, on the one hand, it's kind of helpful because it explains the problem to people, but it's also just more of, please just stop talking about us and leave us alone for a while. There is that element. But I think you're right. There's a lack of joined up understanding of how that relentless focus contributes to the problem. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about how, you know, no other conflict triggers waves of hate crime in this country in the way that Israel and Palestine does. No other conflict generates the size and the frequency and the enduring nature of the protest movement at all. You know, 300,000 people on one of the marches went out to march against Israel, for Palestine. You can cut it however you want. You know, you wouldn't get, you know, 1% of that going out, or certainly not 10% of that going out to protest for the national rights of the Kurdish people, which has been suppressed by Turkey, a NATO member, military ally Britain for, you know, decades on end, huge loss of life during that whole conflict. You know, the war in Yemen that I mentioned, prosecuted by Saudi Arabia and the UAE with British arms. Saudi is the biggest purchaser of British arms in the world, you know, with political backing from Britain and America while we buy their oil and gas. And no one protests about that. And why? You know, why is it? And you can, I know all the rational supposed explanations for it. It's about, you know, we sell them arms and we're political allies of theirs, and there's a colonial legacy and there's an occupation. And well, I've just cited 2 conflicts that tick all of those boxes between them, and no one's interested. And so why is it that people treat Israel killing Palestinians in Gaza as the most egregious crime on earth, but, you know, Assad can kill as many as he wants in Syria, Saudi can kill as many as they want in Yemen, etc., and they don't care? And I'm not, to be clear, I'm not saying this to try and say people shouldn't care about Palestinians dying in Gaza. They should. What I'm interested in is the gap, the discrepancy, what explains the complete black and white difference between how people react to the 2 different things. And I think that also goes to your question of, why is the media coverage so completely overwhelming for one, to the extent that so many others are completely neglected? You know, we just had the situation, you know, the ongoing sort of military operation in Rafah and displacement of huge numbers of people, Palestinians in Rafah. And there's this social media meme, All Eyes on Rafah, which became the most viewed AI generated meme, you know, ever on social media. I mean, AI memes haven't been around for that long, but still. But of course, while all eyes are on Rafah, no eyes are on the famine in Sudan or the civil war in Ethiopia or the ongoing persecution of Muslims in China, etc., etc., etc. And, you know, I often think if every war was as covered by media and as protested against to the extent that Israel's wars are reported on and protested against, there'd be a lot less war in the world. But they aren't. It's only Israel that generates and attracts this just overwhelming focus.
Part of the power, you know, does Israel murder children? Is Israel inherently genocidal? Can there be peace and justice while Israel still exists? Should we, so kind of an embodiment of
I think, I don't know if people can hear me, but I think David's having some problems with the connection. Are you back now, David?
can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Yeah.
Can people hear me?
Yes. Great.
Can you hear me now, people?
We can, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So listen, I'm going to go. Well, sorry, that was. Did you hear the question? All right. Let me try once more with this question, and then anyway, we'll go to the people in the room, and perhaps we should have somebody ready to take over from me if I disappear again. I should mention that I'm in New York right now, so you know, New York doesn't have a very modern infrastructure or.
I'm happy to do that. If it's just about taking questions, I'll gladly be on standby.
Thank you. That's Yaron, right?
That's me, yes, and I sound
right.
like I'm in New York, but I'm not in New York. Yeah.
But my question was simply that there's something we can understand about the power imbalance here by understanding what the questions are which are asked in mainstream debate and on campus and by professors. You know, does Israel murder children? Is Israel committing genocide? Is it essentially genocidal? Should we boycott Israeli colleagues from our campuses? It's the formulation of the questions that encapsulate a lot of the power here already.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It frames the discussion, and but it frames it through assumptions about what direction this conflict faces, about where progressives should stand with the conflict. And it doesn't interrogate any of the other questions that could be asked about where does this conflict fit more broadly in geopolitics, about what does it mean for progressives to effectively align themselves with a movement like Hamas. I mean, the whole Queers for Palestine, Feminists for Palestine phenomenon is, you know, a thing in itself that ought to be interrogated, but isn't within those framings. And then, of course, it just leaves you on the back foot. And this is something that Jewish students having to contest with from their own lecturers in lots of cases at universities. But of course, it's, you know, everyone else as well. And I think the challenge for us is to kind of reframe the questions, I suppose. I don't know if David's disappeared.
Okay, well, I'm Yaron here, and I promised that I'll take over, so I will for a few minutes until David's back. And I think if that's okay, we'll just go. We've got already a couple of hands that have been raised, and I'll just take them in the order that I see them. And apologies if I've kind of missed the order. So Ephraim Nissan first, please.
Hey, I wanted to say I am a scholar actually, and my family background is in Iraq. I think that one thing that especially Professor Shahid will be interested in learning, especially because he's a rapporteur about human rights abuse in Iran. My uncle Edward, when he managed in 1964 to flee to Tehran from Iraq, and later when I was a child, age 9, and saw him, he told me, for all that has happened in Iraq, and it was quite a grand guignol, quite atrocious. He told me when there will be a revolution in Iran, it will be much worse. And my mother was very, very well educated and very conversant with Western civilization. Nevertheless, he calmly told me over the decades, for all that you find in the East, know that in the West, there is something that is even worse. And this is something that we have seen on October the 7th. It is terrible that I have to say that at least she is not alive to see it.
Dave, shall we take a couple more comments, questions,
Sure.
and then address several in the batch,
Yeah.
and then we'll move on. Okay, thanks. Then Maya Flax, please.
Thank you. David, thank you very much for very informative reflections and comments. Thank you. I wanted to ask a question, which is, you talked about the pogroms, you talked about a couple of historical events, but if we focus specifically on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust and compare it to the 7th of October, specifically from the perspective of women, how did women endure anti-Semitism during the Holocaust and during the 7th of October? Do you think that direct parallels can be drawn?
Thanks, Maya. Could I just maybe pick up a comment from the chat on that, which seems to be connected, from Vicky Smith, who asks if you could say something about intersectionality and how it plays into this dialogue, particularly for young people. So Dave, if you'd like to address those questions, and then we move on to the next batch.
Sure. So look, taking them in order, the revolution in Iran, I mean, was hugely significant in a way that I think we still don't properly recognize. If we look at the trajectory of kind of Muslim anti-Semitism, but more sort of Islamist political focus on Israel-Palestine as the primary issue, and the success of Islamist movements, especially in the West, to prioritize it, to convince their own communities that this is the #1 issue that matters. I think that is a process that in a large way began with that revolution, because the way it transformed Islamist politics, even though obviously Iran is Shia, and a lot of the movements and the communities we're talking about are primarily or predominantly Sunni, I still think as a political model, it was hugely influential. You know, in the UK, it was only really in the early 1990s that Islamist movements started to make any headway with persuading British Muslims that Israel and Palestine was the most important issue for them. And it was a very deliberate campaign. Now, what you've got is this sort of merging, this blending of this kind of anti-Semitism / sort of violent anti-Zionism, anti-Zionist rejectionism, sort of playing into much older anti-Semitic trends and ideas in the West. And I'm always very wary of this idea that, you know, immigration has brought anti-Semitism to Western nations. I mean, that's obviously just erases the entire history of anti-Semitism in those Western nations as if it had all been forgotten after the Shoah, which is just nonsense. And again, it's a kind of displacement activity, I think. But it's this combination. I think it is, Islamic traditions about Jews were very different from Christian traditions about Jews in the Middle Ages. Just very different in their origin and how they played out. But this very modern merging, and you look at the way European anti-Semitism influenced kind of Islamist movements, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and then other movements that grew out from that, and the kind of merging of these different forms of revolutionary politics and conspiracy theories that sort of, again, revolved around anti-Semitism. And I think part of what we're seeing is kind of the product of that kind of mixing. In terms of are there parallels to be drawn between 7th of October and the Shoah? I'm always kind of very, very kind of allergic to any comparisons with the Shoah, frankly. I don't like them on principle, and I find the Shoah was such a singular event to an extent that we still don't really fully comprehend it, that I find any comparisons inevitably diminish it. But there is a but going to be coming. Some people have argued that Hamas are even more anti-Semitic than the Nazis because they enjoyed, there are videos of them enjoying the killing on 7th of October. And frankly, that's also nonsense. I mean, there are also plenty of accounts of SS guards and other Nazis enjoying killing Jews during the Shoah. And and again, that's an argument that has a very clear modern political motivation for the people who are making it, and I don't go along with it. But what I do think you get is there are echoes in how these things play out. Firstly, because there is an ideological connection, there is a political lineage here, and to the extent that Nazi ideology did influence to certain degrees kind of Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist movements in the 30s and 40s and sort of play their way through. But also I think, and I suppose this is my reluctance, Maya, in terms of your question, that there are comparisons between the persecutions meted out to Jewish women in the Shoah and on October 7th. But are they unique to those two events, or is that reflecting more broadly the maltreatment and persecution of women in not just in wars, in conflicts, in other periods of persecution, not even including Jews as well? Sexual violence is something that has repeated in lots of contexts and lots of places. So that's kind of my only thought. But I think for us as Jews, it is inevitable that we will make those connections, and it is legitimate for us to make those connections, because what is the collective memory and experience through which we interpret what happened on October 7th? Inevitably, the Shoah is going to play a part in that. And it would be weird if it didn't. And the final question about intersectionality, I mean, look, this goes back to this whole idea that all these different systems of oppression and types of oppression all connect with each other, and Palestine explains it all, or Palestine is top of the pile, and no one can be free until Palestine's free, and so on and so on. And it sort of brings people into this movement, and you especially see this amongst younger people and on campus. It brings in people who may come from different, sort of originally different motivations, but who get almost sucked into and feel they can't resist the idea that Palestine is the most important of all of them, and that if they don't get involved in this movement, then they're not really seeking liberation for everyone. And again, it has no sort of, there's nothing concrete there really. But what it does is it, at the same time as prioritizing Palestine as an issue, of course, it diminishes anti-Semitism, so it's barely at the bottom of the pile, but certainly not even recognized, because Because if you have this framing, this understanding of the world, that everything is about systems of power and everything is about the oppressor and the oppressed, and that's the way to understand every conflict, then it's only 2 or 3 logical steps to the assumption that, well, Jews are really powerful because Israel's the more powerful partner. Israel is the politically white partner, combatant in the conflict. Therefore, Jews are powerful, Jews can't suffer racism, etc., etc. I mean, we know all these arguments, we've heard all these arguments. And that just brings you right back to the same old anti-Semitic stereotypes. And it's just another, we've been arguing for, 150 years or more that left-wing thinking is susceptible to anti-Semitism in certain conditions and certain framing. And there are still people on the left, even people who know all of these writings really well, who don't understand that basic point. And so it's a movement that will always be susceptible because there are so many people in this movement who just don't see it and don't recognize it and are therefore incapable of resisting it.
Okay, thanks. Well, we've got many questions and we'll take another batch. Just so that you know who your stand-in moderator is, my name is Yaron Matras and I'm Associate Fellow of the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. And next on my list here is Daniel Ben-Ami, please.
Hi, David. I just wondered if you'd revived your views to an extent in the last very intense 8 months since 7th of October. So don't get me wrong, clearly anti-Semitism was a very serious problem before the 7th of October, and it's a very serious problem now, there's no question of that. But with the benefit of hindsight, would you, do you think in the past you underestimated certain factors or you overestimated certain factors or there are new factors? To what extent is there a difference between the first and second edition, taking into account the experience of the last 8 months?
So
let's end, Dave, if that's okay, take a couple more.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, sorry.
Matthew has a hand on, but if we could perhaps see if you could switch your video on, I think we might.
Oh, hello.
Okay, yeah, we can hear
Hi.
you.
I'm afraid I can't do video right now.
Can't do video. Yeah, fine.
But
Go ahead.
Here I am. Dave, thank you so much for your talk today. I've been enjoying your book over the last a week or so since the new version came out. I don't mean to ramble. I will try and keep it short. But as a brief point of note, I've been a member of the Labour Party since 2015 under Ed Miliband. I saw firsthand the intense hostility towards Jewish people, towards anyone who supported the right of Israel to exist. At that time, I am not Jewish myself, but my best friend is, and so I've been through that period of our history and sort of experienced it to an extent as a outsider, I suppose. Since October 7th, I have had to, or have felt the need to, very seriously re-examine my own views on Israel, on my understanding of anti-Semitism. I thought I understood it at the time, but I think I only had a glimpse of it, really. One thing I'm interested to ask you about is that I've come across research by David Deutsch, which has been developed by Richard Landis, about what he calls the pattern. He calls it a pattern. And the idea is that anti-Semitism for Deutsch, and Deutsch is a Jewish scholar at University of Oxford, anti-Semitism is sort of an outgrowth of what he calls a pattern, which is a consistent demand on the part of a non-Jew that they have the moral right to hurt emotionally, physically, etc., the Jew. Not that they necessarily will exercise that right, but that it would be legitimate were they to exercise it. And I came across this idea, and I felt that it helped to understand or explain, at least in part, what's going on right now, which is that since the establishment of the State of Israel as the Jewish state, the Jews now have, of course, the right and the ability, to defend themselves. And so when we see explosions of anti-Semitism every single time that Israel actually does defend itself, that there's something in this theory that would help explain that, or at least to give some kind of background to it, which is that insofar as Israel does in fact successfully defend the Jewish people, at least in Israel, perhaps this is what it irritates the virus almost. It sort of agitates it, because the more that Israel does defend itself, the more under threat the notion is that people have the right to, at least the moral, of course, a moral right to hurt Jews. I hope that was more or less coherent. I wasn't quite expecting to be picked for a question, but yes, I'd appreciate your answer, or your thoughts at least. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Let's just take one more from the chat and then allow Dave to answer. And there's a question or comment from Carmel Mati. What can non-Jews in Britain do to fight anti-Semitism and support the Jewish community? Over to you, Dave.
Thank you. All good questions. First of all, Daniel, what surprised me, or what's different after October 7th? It would be, I think if any of us look at everything that's happened since October 7th and say, well, nothing surprised us there, then we must be missing something, because something is different. Having said that, it didn't come out of a clear blue sky. You know, those of us who've been following anti-Semitism, who've researched it for years, which are as many of us on this call, a lot of what's happened was foreseeable, but there are other things that I think are new. One of them is, as I've said, the way that it began and what that revealed about the true nature and depth of anti-Semitism, that this all began immediately on October 7th. And I think we should recognize the what is new and different about that. But I think there's something else going on. You know, anti-Semitism before October 7th, even when it was peaking, even when it had its moments of surging, even during the Corbyn years and so on, you could sort of identify where it was. It was kind of within particular discrete sections of society. I think after October 7th, it feels like it's kind of burst its banks. It feels like it's popping up all over the place. You know, whether that's not just in schools and universities, but in arts, in culture, in museums, in literature, and in politics, and all over social media, and in workplaces. You know, the places where people are hearing anti-Semitic comments, or people supporting Hamas, and so it feels like it's just more all around. And I think that is partly because it just sort of feels that way, and that's what social media does to you. So social media tries to convince you that more people hate you than actually do, and the world is a more hateful place than it actually is. But I do think it's spread, and it's pulled in more people who've never really thought about that before. So that's new. I do think we have to try and keep this in proportion. And this speaks to the third question about what non-Jewish people can do. It is still the case that most people in this country don't think about any of this stuff at all. And if they do, they think anti-Semitism is appalling. We learned that during the Corbyn years. And I personally think we were reminded of it with the voting figures for Eurovision as well, which I think surprised a lot of people. But I do think we need to try and remember that and cling on to it. One thing that's changed, you know, the original version of my book was quite optimistic, and I am normally quite optimistic about these things. It's been harder to cling on to that optimism since 7th of October. I'm not saying we should just dispense with it, but I think the thing that makes it hard to be really optimistic and assume that everything will go back to normal and be fine is the broader geopolitics in which this surge of anti-Semitism is happening. You know, not just the fact that Israel is being attacked on 4 different fronts by Iranian proxies and by Iran itself, but the fact that this is coinciding with the war in Ukraine, where Russia seems to, you know, maybe turn the tide a bit, the fact that Russia basically and Iran between them won the Syrian civil war for their client there, and basically, you know, effectively the West's lost it to the extent that the West was a factor in it. These big trends going on in the world, the sort of rolling back of liberal democracy in some countries in Europe, and what's happening in American politics, and so on and so on and so on. that's the context in which the anti-Semitism is happening. And that, I think, makes it more worrying and more dangerous. So if you want to know what else has changed in the book, you'll have to read it. Here it is. The third question, the second question about this idea of a pattern. You know, the way I put it in the book is anti-Semitism is a tradition in Western societies. It's not ubiquitous, it's not all pervasive, but it happens often enough in history that I think it's fair to call it a tradition. And it happens in certain times and in certain ways. And one of the things that Israel's existence and Israel's power does is it is a challenge to that tradition. It subverts that tradition, because in this anti-Semitic tradition, Jews are not supposed to fight back. Jews are not supposed to be killing other non-Jews. It's the non-Jews who get to kill the Jews without any kind of comeback to them. And people don't like traditions and customs being obstructed or subverted or ruined in this way. So I do think at a deep level, there is something in this, that the transformation in the Jewish condition that the creation of Israel brought about fundamentally challenges some of these sort of very deep-seated trends. And so then you're going to get pushback against that, especially when people get the chance to attack Israel rhetorically. I mean, I'm talking about people in the West, because it kind of reestablishes the traditional way of doing things.
Thank you, and it is nice to hear a bit of optimism here and there, a bit more than just between the lines, because I think for many of us, I'm sure it's been a very, very difficult period. We'll take two more questions that remain, and then we'll have a short announcement before we conclude. But we will, of course, then hear from Dave on those two questions. So I've got Stank first, or Stank to make a stance.
Thanks. It's actually Stan Kroop from Glasgow. I have the same problem with my camera as Matthew.
Please go ahead.
But my query, it's about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Before the 7th of October, I would have said and did say that anti-Zionism is really just traditional 20th century anti-Semitism, slightly different in terms of the vocabulary they use to Zionists rather than Jews, but essentially it's typical 20th century anti-Semitism. My question is, after the 7th of October, can one still say that, or are we looking at something not new, but something that's moved on from traditional 20th century anti-Semitism in terms of all the stuff you get now about post-colonial theory, intersectionality, Frantz Fanon, and so on? So basically what I'm saying is that, you know, anti-Semitism was a form of Judeophobia in the 20th century. It's all about race and so on. Are we talking about something that's a continuation, certainly, but it's also something new in terms of recasting hostilities to Jews in a kind of 21st century form, you know, post-colonial theory and so on?
Thank you. And we have a final question from Luba, please.
Hi, Dave, thanks so much for articulating what I think so many of us have thought and felt over the past 8 months. I wanted to ask if you can say something about the fact that a lot of the people that seem to be erupting in anti-Semitism recently / anti-Zionism are some of the same people that, as you've said, consider themselves to be the most progressive, the most, I don't want to use the word woke, but the people that are, you know, they're LGBTQI friendly, and they are, I'm in Australia, so they're, you know, alive to the challenges of Australian Indigenous people, and they're for every other minority group, and they're sort of they want to check their privilege, all these other things, and yet they have this blind spot somehow when it comes to anti-Semitism and to Jewish people, and seem to be the most susceptible to it.
Thanks. I mean, these two questions very much connect with each other. Look, anti-Semitism throughout history has always had basic continuities, but adapts and reshapes to reflect the politics of the time, the discourse of the time, both through language and through ideas and through modes of thinking, but also to reflect what are the obsessions of any given society at any given time. And I think that is what we are seeing at the moment with the way that, you know, we're currently looking at a type of anti-Semitism coming from this kind of, you know, post-colonial left, sort of anti-imperialist left. You know, not that there are not other types of anti-Semitism as well. And if we look at the right and the far right, you're finding different types of language and different ideas and different obsessions. For them, it's all about immigration and so on. So that's how anti-Semitism works and always has worked, really. So to a certain extent, it's doing the same old, but same old often looks very new because it always adapts to reflect what is really cutting edge in these, not just ideas, but in people's deepest fears about what's going on in the world and obsessions about what's going on in the world. But let's not forget, just as the creation of the State of Israel was profoundly changed the status of Jewish people, it's profoundly changed the way anti-Semitism works and what it relates to, because it's something really big and actually powerful for anti-Semitism to really cling onto and focus all its sort of hatred onto. So that plays a really important role. In terms of Luba's question about people who believe they're really progressive and who really do campaign for genuinely important human rights causes and liberation and so on, I think there's something really fascinating going on these university campuses. You know, a lot of these campuses, I've noticed that the protesters who set up these tent encampments, they call the area where they put down their tents, they've called them liberated zones, right? They did this in the States, but I noticed this, you know, at Oxford University and at Cambridge and others, they call it a liberated zone. And I was thinking, who have they liberated it from, right? These are students at their own university that they pay to go to, who have full right to use these zones whenever they want. And by putting their tents, you know what, they're liberating it from their own university that they're members of. It makes no sense. All they've done by putting the tents down is actually restrict access to it for everyone else. So what's going on? And I think you combine that idea that it's liberated with the fact that there's, you know, whether the protesters, you know, even if they're not Palestinian, they're not Arab, but they're wearing kaffirs, they're wearing Palestinian colors, there's a lot of dressing up involved. There's a lot of kind of cosplaying, a lot of kind of role playing but what they are role playing is really important, because in their mental and moral universe, the most heroic thing you can be is to be oppressed. And not only to be oppressed, but to be a freedom fighter. And yet these people, these students, they're not oppressed at all, and they're not unfree. They are, in some cases, amongst the most kind of privileged people in our societies, right? Not all. I mean, some students, you know, go through various challenges, but once you're a student at Oxford University, you're pretty privileged. And so, you know, so to overcome that, you know, there's this kind of fantasy role play of the most heroic. And the most heroic are the most unprivileged, are the freedom fighters. So they liberate a patch of grass, you know, outside Manchester University or whatever. And it's all, I mean, it's absurd if you think about it, but it's a reflection of their politics, but also of their kind of moral hierarchy and moral universe that they are inhabiting, and how they like to imagine themselves as being, because there is an inner conflict between being a student at one of the best universities in the world, when in your head the greatest thing you can be is the complete opposite of the privilege scale. So how do you overcome that? And you overcome that by putting down a tent and not even sleeping in it. Meanwhile, most of these tents are empty overnight. But I think that's what's going on, and it's bizarre. But then a lot of student politics is bizarre.
On that note, yes, we all remember, or many of us remember, what it was like to be a student and whether we occupied buildings and set up protest tents. Thank you very, very much, Dave, for sharing your insights and analyses with us. I was very inspired reading the first edition of the book, and looking forward to looking at the editions. And I think beyond the intellectual value of trying to make sense of the situation and development, I think I'm not alone in feeling that these conversations are also giving us strength in what is really for all of us a very, very difficult time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And before we leave, I just have two short announcements. We're back next week with another event. David Hirsh will be in conversation with Shalom Lapin about his new book, just appeared, called The New Antisemitism. And if you think it's not new, then come and find out why it might be. Or if you agree that it's new, come and find out why. That takes place in London on the 13th of June, next week, in the Wiener Library. But I believe there is also an online participation, which is fabulous, because tonight we've had people from, I think, at least 3 different continents. So we'll continue that outreach. And so you can go onto the website or follow the Twitter account or the Eventbrite to get information and get access and register for that. And finally, I'll end with our standard announcements, which is all of our online events are free. But we would appreciate a donation if you've found it informative and would like to see us host more events like this. Martine will post a link for donations in the chat, but in case you miss it for some reason, it's also at the top of the Twitter profile for the London Centre, and I'm sure also on the website. So thank you very much again. I'm talking here, and I'm getting a notice actually on my screen that it sounds like I am speaking in Arabic, and would I like to provide a transcription? I'm a linguist by profession, and I wonder what AI is doing these days, recognizing languages, but some things seem to go wrong. Don't bet on it and don't count it. Thanks, everybody, again, and thanks to Dave in particular, and we'll see you soon. Bye.